No one paid attention to Jean-Claude Van Damme's warnings concerning Steven Seagal. The rivalry was dismissed for decades as a joke, a holdover from the dramatic action films of the 1990s. However, all changed in 2025. It didn't make the news. A press conference was not held. Van Damme eventually delivered the things we weren't prepared to hear during a leaked FaceTime chat during a private supper. He disclosed more than simply personal information. For years, the industry had subtly disregarded it. Don't assume it's all ego between two celebrities. The truth is disturbing and goes deeper. The rise of two action icons. In the world of broken arms and high kicks, few rivalries have ever captivated Hollywood's attention as much as those between Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme. It wasn't formally announced. No news conference. No feud in public to move ticket sales. Fans, however, were aware of a problem. You could sense it without being a tabloid addict. The Brussels muscles and the ponytailed Aikido master had a subtle but noticeable strain. In 1988, Van Damme made his debut with Bloodsport. He had a showy, adaptable combat technique that was designed for the big screen. Audiences adored his ability to combine the grace of a dancer with the strength of a fighter. He was ubiquitous by the early 1990s, kicking bad men into oblivion, dividing between chairs, and smiling through one-liners with that distinctive Belgian accent. Seagal then appeared. He was above the law, difficult to kill, and fighting for justice. He struck with force, spoke quietly. Seagal let his wrists speak for him as Van Damme swung amid the staged chaos. His Aikido abilities were ruthless, effective, and serene, almost ghostly. With a simple flip of his palm, he eliminated his opponents in addition to winning battles. His characters were walking warning signs rather than underdogs. Initially, it appeared that both could coexist. Various fan bases, various styles, lean and limber, Van Damme was the underdog, battle his way through a competition. Seagal was the man who entered a bar, hardly moved, and left a heap of corpses in his wake. Comparisons, however, were unavoidable. People argued over who could prevail in a genuine battle, who was tougher, and who had a stronger martial arts background. They drew the lines. Although the internet had not yet taken over, video stores and locker rooms became heated debate spots. Additionally, the two men avoided each other while the fans conjectured. In public, silence fell. No mutual adulation, no staged images, no film collaborations. It was just an odd absence that began to resemble avoidance. By the mid-1990s, more than just the fans were taking notice. Producers and directors would privately acknowledge that the two were incompatible. Supporters of Van Damme vowed that he was the real deal and that his kickboxing record was authentic. However, Seagal's presence was distinct and less approachable, more frightening. He exuded a tough guy persona that he believed in, rather than merely playing it. After a while, their careers diverged. Despite his public problems, substance abuse, and a few career setbacks, Van Damme never gave up. Meanwhile, Seagal ventured into uncharted area, working in law enforcement, making connections abroad, and developing a personal brand that started to draw more questions than applause. However, in some way, the question persisted even after they were dropped from the A list. What actually took place between the two of them? The majority believed it to be ego, two action stars who were too arrogant to acknowledge their dislike for one another. But beneath the surface, there was more. Something colder. A part of Van Damme remained reserved whenever Seagal's name was mentioned. even though he normally played the open book and smiled for the camera. He didn't say much, not on talk shows or in interviews. However, it was clipped when he did. Be cautious, as if he was still keeping an eye on his back. For decades, Van Damme kept whatever transpired between them secret. However, peace is not implied by silence. Waiting is all that is required at times. And something changed in 2025. One picture, one meal, and then an unexpected statement. However, we haven't arrived yet. We must first return to the peaceful years. Invisible to the public, the animosity was all too real behind closed doors during that period. Van Damme tried to warn us, but we didn't want to hear it, as you will know when you see what was hiding in plain sight. Tension rises behind the cameras. Although roundhouse kicks and explosions were captured on camera, the action behind the scenes was much more subtle, psychological, and poisonous. The public only saw the posters after Steven Seagal and Jean-Claude Van Damme rose to fame on a global scale. The silent campaign that was taking place in the background was invisible to them. It began with murmurs. In interviews, Seagal never failed to emphasize that he was the true martial artist. Although he would never initially address other action stars by name, it was obvious what he meant when he casually dismissed them. Some, he said, were dancers posing as combatants. On camera, he once grinned and stated, "Don't talk to me about fighting if you've never really fought." It didn't take a genius to figure out who he was referring to. Van Damme heard it. Of course he did. Word gets around quickly in the industry, and he never retaliated. But he smiled, signed autographs, kicked things on talk shows, and continued working. However, on set, people began to notice a pattern. Whenever Seagal's name was mentioned, Van Damme would become quiet and uneasy. Van Damme had worked hard for his break, hustling in law, sleeping in cars, and begging producers to watch his spinning kick. He didn't come from connections. He came from hunger. He never disparaged Seagal, but the silence spoke louder than words. Seagal, on the other hand, had arrived with a different story. He was exotic, mysterious, and associated with influential people. By the early 1990s, it was becoming evident that Seagal's influence went beyond acting. Some industry insiders started to publicly state that if you crossed him, projects would stop, callbacks would not come, and some names would be discreetly eliminated from consideration. Some people thought he leaned into that aura a bit too much, while others thought he used it. One former casting director said, "If Seagal didn't like you, good luck working with his circle." He said, "You didn't just lose one role, you lost 5. At the time, Van Damme was dealing with his own issues. Fame had taken its toll. He partied too much, made snap decisions, and strained relationships. However, those closest to him said that his actions weren't the biggest setback. What kept things confusing was that Van Damme remained silent, despite the fact that someone else was actively undermining him. Someone they thought was Seagal. If there was animosity, why not just come out and say it? However, Van Damme had discovered the hard way that complaining aloud didn't always help. In Hollywood, doing so could get you labeled as difficult, so he kept his head down and waited. In private, however, the picture was different. According to a friend, he would joke about Seagal, yes, but occasionally he would simply stop smiling and say, "One day I'll say it, but not now." That day wouldn't come for decades. Meanwhile, fans believed what they saw, which was 2 elderly action stars going about their separate lives, possibly not as friends, but not adversaries either. They were unaware that Seagal was making moves that no one could see, and that the rivalry was being played behind the scenes like a silent game of chess. It all stayed hidden until the day Jean-Claude Van Damme finally picked up the phone, looked directly into the camera, and decided to stop holding it in. But we're not there yet. First, we need to talk about the night it nearly came out. The night at Stallone's mansion, the Sylvester Stallone party incident. By 1997, the tension between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal had been growing for years, and everyone in the industry knew it, even if the public didn't. There had been long silences, rumors, and jabs, but no direct confrontation, that is, until one peculiar, muggy night in Miami, when fate brought the two men to the same address, Sylvester Stallone's mansion. It was supposed to be a celebration, and Stallone, at the height of his post-cliffhanger confidence, threw a lavish party full of A-listers, producers, and egos big enough to tilt the Earth's axis. Seagal and Van Damme were invited for reasons that are still up for debate, but it didn't take long for the atmosphere to change. Perhaps Stallone wanted to play peacemaker, or perhaps he just liked chaos. In contrast, Seagal entered like a myth, wearing a black coat, sunglasses indoors, and slow steps. He didn't greet anyone unless they greeted him first, and the room shrank the instant they made eye contact. Stallone later compared it to watching two storms pass each other quietly. He knew Seagal might be there, but his friends warned him that he wasn't coming for a fight. After a few drinks and more sidelong glances, Seagal reportedly started talking loudly, not to Van Damme directly, but to a small group of people. He told a story that ended with the line, "Some of these guys couldn't last 5 seconds in a real fight. They're ballet dancers with good PR." That was the fuse. Van Damme heard it, waited, and then approached. Van Damme, by all accounts, didn't yell or throw a punch. Instead, he simply stepped in and said the words that people had been waiting 10 years to hear. "Let's go, right now." Outside, everyone froze, and some thought it was a joke. He was calm at first. "You got something to say to me?" he asked, loud enough for the room to hear. Seagal looked at him, and then he laughed. "You wouldn't last 1 minute with me, Jean-Claude." Van Damme was not grinning, though, and he repeated himself. "Let's go. You said you could take me. Here I am." Seagal stared, then turned and left. You would think it would stop there, but it didn't. Later that evening, when Seagal appeared at a local nightclub, Van Damme followed him, and several witnesses claim he confronted him once more, this time with even more direct questions. "Are you going to keep running?" The story became legend, but no one ever really explained what made Van Damme snap that night. Was it just his usual arrogance, or had something happened behind the scenes that made Van Damme finally decide enough was enough? He never clarified, and in interviews after the fact, Van Damme dismissed the story. Seagal left the club without saying anything. Stallone would later confirm the story, saying that Van Damme was too strong, and Seagal didn't want any part of him. For years, the story was just another Hollywood bar tale, a hypothetical fight that never happened. However, what most people failed to realize was that Van Damme wasn't trying to fight Seagal for sport. Rather, he was trying to expose something deeper, something that wouldn't fully surface until decades later. During a FaceTime, he once said, "It's not important. I'm finally revealing this. Jean-Claude speaks." It began like any innocuous piece of nostalgia, a blurry Instagram reel of Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal sitting together at dinner, with Seagal at one end and Van Damme at the other. There were a few smiles and some small talk. However, first we need to go back to the moment that fooled everyone, The dinner photo that made people think it was all water under the bridge. No edits, no soundtrack, just Jean-Claude Van Damme staring into the camera and saying what so many had suspected but never heard aloud. Jean-Claude Van Damme tried to warn us about Steven Seagal, but we didn't listen. The picture that had once been seen as closure was now seen as a mask. The crew kept the footage quiet for a while, but someone leaked it. Quiet trap. A moment caught not in peace but in finality, and now the world was listening for the first time in decades. But the fallout was just getting started. The industry responds. The FaceTime call clip didn't go viral online, with no breaking news headlines or overnight firestorm, but instead spread slowly and quietly, like smoke slipping under a door. However, for those who did see it, those who had followed Van Damme's career from the beginning, it struck differently. They recalled the old rumors, the things that never quite added up, the promising roles Van Damme was set to lead that suddenly changed direction, the strange lull in his career just as he seemed poised, and the few thousand views shared between longtime fans, niche forums, and a handful of action movie obsessives who still cared enough to watch all the way through. In Hollywood circles, the response was quiet but genuine. A few producers texted each other the clip, a couple of stuntmen shared it in group chats, and nobody posted anything publicly. At the time, it all seemed like bad timing, possibly burnout, or personal mistakes. But now that I'm finally revealing this, everything started to feel different. One mid-level executive who had worked in distribution in the late 1990s acknowledged that Seagal did, in fact, have influence in some circles, but he wasn't outspoken about it. Instead, he made it clear who he didn't like, and you were expected to read between the lines. Another source, a former assistant on a project Van Damme had been attached to, said that the conversations had resumed after being absent for more than 20 years. There was an unwritten understanding that even in situations where people didn't want to blame, Van Damme's silence over the years hadn't been because he had nothing to say, rather. It was because he understood how the industry worked, and that talking too much could make things worse or permanent. He recalled hearing that a conflict of interest had suddenly been raised behind closed doors. No one explained what it meant, and Van Damme was dropped. The project proceeded without him. The Instagram post of that dinner, which was initially interpreted as a reconciliation, suddenly took on a darker meaning among those in the know. A few industry blogs picked it up, but only as passing mentions. A curious moment between two former rivals. No one wanted to stir things up, so he had nothing left to lose by telling the truth now. Years later, when careers had cooled and reputations had solidified, there was a quiet shift among longtime colleagues, but Seagal stayed silent. No interview, no comment, no denial, just the typical posts about his ranch, a few old film clips, and a quote about forgiveness that seemed more like a placeholder than a statement. Van Damme didn't go back and comment on the clip once it was released, because he didn't need to, and the people he meant it for had already heard it. It wasn't about public retaliation, rather. It was about finally telling his side of the story, aloud, on record, before it was too late. Although the majority of the world moved on, the story didn't break the internet, except for the small group of people who had always wondered what actually happened between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal. A little more respect and a few messages sent behind the scenes might have been sufficient for Van Damme. There was no media storm, no tabloid frenzy, and the dinner photo remained online, unchanged, uncaptioned, just two men sitting across from each other. Why didn't we listen sooner? Too little, too late? For most people, the moment passed without a ripple. It was just another old Hollywood story, another rivalry that faded into obscurity. For those who knew what to look for, everything about that image felt different. Jean-Claude Van Damme had been silent for years, and whether it was out of pride, fear, or just plain tiredness, he had chosen to keep quiet when it might have mattered most. By the time he finally said, "I'm finally revealing this," his story didn't make headlines. But perhaps it wasn't purposeful. Seagal never answered because he didn't have to. His silence had always been a part of the equation. The kind that casts a shadow over a room without ever raising its voice. That quiet dominance, the unspoken authority, had followed him throughout his career. The truth wasn't loud, dramatic, measured, calm, and deeply personal. And in that stillness, there was something more powerful than outrage, clarity. The industry didn't change overnight, and no apologies were made. No projects were revived. But among a small, elderly circle of insiders who remembered the casting meetings, the phone calls, and the instinctive feelings they couldn't explain, Van Damme's story stuck. Perhaps that's precisely why it took so long to come to light. People didn't want to believe that one man could covertly erase another, but now it seemed completely plausible. Even more unsettling is the fact that the warning had always been there, the lengthy silences during interviews, the blank stares, the expression on Van Damme's face when Seagal's name was brought up, and that he wasn't hiding the truth. He was just waiting for the right time to speak it. However, the world wasn't listening, and now that they had, it didn't matter, as it once would have, because the damage had already been done. The doors closed, the roles were lost, and the roles were lost. A single reel on Instagram, a silent clip from a FaceTime call, and a truth that now hovers just beneath the surface of two careers that shaped a generation of action movies. Van Damme didn't want to fight. That dinner had arrived too late to fix anything, too late to change anyone's mind, and too late to bring justice to a feud that never needed to happen in the first place. He attempted to warn us about Steven Seagal, but we simply ignored him. Which side are you on? Please share your thoughts in the comments. He wanted peace, but not silence. In the end, he got both, but not simultaneously.